Hey everyone, thanks for joining. Today I'm speaking with Inaya Folarin Iman. Inaya is on the board of directors for the Free Speech Union. She's a columnist for Spiked Online, and she's also a writer. Hi Inaya, thank you for coming on.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah. So I've been following you for a little bit, and free speech is kind of one of my. It's the only dog I have in any fight, and
Yeah.
I've been following you for a little bit. I've been following the Free Speech Union. So what got you into speaking out for free speech, and like why do you think it's necessary right now? Like, where did this all come from?
Yeah, I've been really interested in ideas in particular since I was a teenager. So I'm pretty much part of the YouTube generation. And quickly into the inception of YouTube, I capitalized it as an opportunity to essentially, find out more about the world and to expose myself to all of the complexities and diversities of ideas that existed. And so very early on, I became really interested in kind of society and politics. And I pursued that at university, and I'd really hoped that university would essentially become a space to which that process of engaging with ideas would be done in a deeper, more intellectually rigorous way. And as much as I enjoyed university, unfortunately, in the area of kind of ideas and intellectual diversity, I didn't necessarily find it to be so. And I tried and endeavored to cultivate my academic life to be one where I did get to explore ideas deeply. So, one of the things that I did, and this is really some of the scenarios that really catapulted me into the debate about free speech, was I ended up becoming involved in my student newspaper. And I remember I suggested to the writers in my student newspaper, if anybody wanted to look at this particular movement in Britain, I don't know if it's in America as well or in Canada, I'm called Decolonize the Curriculum. I don't know if you've heard of it.
Oh God, yeah.
Yeah, so it's essentially that this movement that claims to be working to broaden out the curriculum and invite different speakers and intellectuals from across the world. But what I personally found it to be was a deeply kind of ideological movement with a political agenda to essentially deconstruct all of what is valuable and important about Western society. I mean, they consider objectivity, everything to be Western imperialist constructs. So I, as part of the student newspaper, suggested that we examine this, and it caused a huge backlash at university. Everyone was like, "Why would you question it? By doing that, I'm inviting white supremacy and all of these things." And it was a really stark moment where I realized that even basic kind of questioning of dogma and kind of dominant sensibilities, particularly on campus, wasn't something that was welcomed. And I knew in that moment that freedom of speech was massively under threat if this was the next generation that will be taking control of our institutions.
Okay, what timeline was this?
So this was it was as recently as 2018. Yeah,
2018.
so yeah, I only left university last year. Yeah, so I got involved in free speech, the free speech movement in Britain very very quickly. I started hosting free speech debates on campus. I used to work for an organisation called Index on Censorship, and then yeah, I essentially became a free speech activist from all of.
Yeah, I mean the reason I asked the timeline is because I had such a bit of my background. I came back to Canada in 2014, and I'd been away in war zones for about 12 years.
Yeah.
Social media wasn't a thing when I left. Don't really have it on war zones. They don't want you to tag yourself on a Facebook post saying I'm here in like Afghanistan or something, right? They don't want
Yeah.
that. So I come back, and like even then I see it. Like, one of the starkest things I saw was at University of Missouri. There was a protest going on. There was a journalism professor. So professor of
Wow.
journalism. There was a student journalist covering the protest, and the journalism professor, you could hear on mic saying, "Get some muscle over here and get this guy out of here."
Wow.
And that to me, I was like, "What's going on?" And that's when I started looking into this.
Mm.
So that culture you mentioned, I mean, I've been seeing it for a while now, but now it's like out in your face. Like I think it was the Smithsonian. They took it down, but they had that graphic of what is white supremacy culture, right? And they
Mm.
talked about things like objectivity, punctuality, basically, professionalism.
It's incredibly demeaning. Like I don't. A lot of these people are acting in good intentions, but if you are not paying attention to the social consequences of what you're promoting, then I have to question people's intention. To suggest that objectivity, punctuality, individuality are somehow Western supremacist constructs, I mean, that really reveals such a demeaning and low view of people that are not white. If you think that.
I want to compare the UK with the US and Canada, because Canada, we have a constitution, but we're a parliamentary system like the UK, and I mean our independence from the UK is hugely different than the United States. It wasn't a open conflict, but our rights for free speech aren't guaranteed the same as in the States. Whereas in the UK, you guys don't have a constitution, but you had a culture of open debate and free speech. I mean, for Christ's sakes, Milton and Mill came from the UK, uh, but in the US, I mean, the founding fathers, you can talk about them and what they wrote, and they were building off the Enlightenment, but it got wrapped up into law, and I see pluses and minuses for all three of those things. Like living in the UK, how do you compare, like at least the US with the UK? Like, do you think it's better having it in law, or better having it as more of a in the culture that everyone wants open debate?
Yeah, so yeah, there are really, important differences. As you mentioned, we don't necessarily have a constitution. We have something called constitutional conventions. But regardless, there is a very long tradition of free speech and liberty, as you described, in terms of John Stuart Mill, Areopagitica, obviously the Enlightenment, but far back from that in terms of the British Bill of Rights and Magna Carta. So that tradition is deeply embedded into British culture, but obviously similar as we're seeing in Western society more broadly, that has been eroded and that's been challenged. I think that there are positives and negatives. I think obviously, having a constitution that protects that and guarantees that makes it more forthright when it comes to people attempting to challenge it. I mean, this is your inalienable right, as it is written, and I think that that is very powerful. But I guess the British system for me also works because we have to continually make the argument, and I think that that is really important. I don't think free speech necessarily should just be assumed to be a given or assumed to be something that just exists. I think that people deeply need to understand it. They need to create a culture and a society that cultivates criticism and appreciates that robust and open debate. So I think not necessarily having it written down in a constitutional mechanism still enables people to be able to make that case and for that argument to be won. But unfortunately, as the reality we are seeing, even though America has a constitution and Britain doesn't, we're still facing similar kinds of challenges to free speech, whether that is on campus, but even more societal attitudes more broadly, whether that is in the media and institutions itself. So I think that even having a constitution doesn't necessarily protect it in relation to how it might play out in people's perhaps authoritarian attitudes on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with most of that, and I wish there was a way you could do both, and I think you should do both because the Constitution is great. The U.S. First Amendment, as far as I can tell, is the best law out there to protect your rights of speech from the government.
Totally agree.
But it's a law, like it's an amendment, right? In the name, you can change that. If the population wants that law changed, there's a process to go through it, and the law can be changed. So I think you need to have that firm law, but at the same time, you need to inculcate in the population. The free speech argument. I find like I like what you guys are doing. I like what a few other people are doing. I was lucky enough to get an early copy of Jane Lindsay and Helen Pluckers' book, and they talk about it in the last chapter. You know, it's not my right to blab. It's your right to decide what you get to choose to listen to, and that's where the free speech argument should go. And I think you have the strong law, but at the same time, you let people know that it's the harm that's done to a society when you start censoring is far greater than the harm that's done by bad speech. And
Oh, absolutely.
go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, and this is some of the really important arguments that are fundamentally being missed from the conversation. I mean, the way in which free speech has been framed as necessarily a mechanism to spread hate, to me, reveals such a shallow and fundamentally, a fundamental misunderstanding of, what free speech has meant historically, and actually who has benefited from free speech the most. Free speech is not, if you are a liar, if you're a charlatan, if you are a tyrannical individual or organization, you're not going to want free speech. It is generally speaking, as I'm sure you'll know, that the people who are in the minority, whether that is ethnic or sexual or even ideological minority, who benefit from free speech, to be able to kind of articulate their grievances, their interests, challenge the structures that are maybe subjugating them. It's often the least powerful people that benefit from free speech the most. And as you were describing, many of these arguments in terms of what actually free speech means and how it plays out are really being missed from the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, okay, I do little things here and there, but I did something and I said, we have an example of this. You can, well, I actually have several, but we have like a really good example. If you look at the Arab world, so the Muslim Arab world, from the end of the Golden Age, or even just slightly before, they stopped the enterprise of free inquiry. The Mongols came in, sacked Baghdad, all that was destroyed, and then it came into Europe from different roads. But because that enterprise was stopped, once the Mongols left, they never went back to go get that information back. And you can look at the Arab world now. I mean, how many Nobel Prizes came out of there? Like just one innovation that came out of the Arab world from after the time of the Golden Age. There was some good poetry, there was some good art, but there were no advancements, nothing. And you can see that society.
Yeah, absolutely. Without free speech, how do you innovate? If people are existing in a climate and a culture where they don't feel that they can express challenging or controversial or provocative ideas, the ideas that actually force us to question ourselves and to re-understand and reorganize, then you are essentially stunting the intellectual capability of a society. I think that we can see it. It plays out. The societies that have the most freedom, that have the most free speech, are the societies that are have the most human innovation and expression and expansion. There's only one trajectory where people are traveling. We generally speaking, we're not traveling to the places en masse, at least, that are trying to limit our capacity to be able to speak, and so it speaks for itself, I think.
Yeah. You'd mentioned the decolonization stuff, and if you remember the Hong Kong protests back in December, at least,
Yeah.
because it's much worse now with China's done, but you saw it in the U.S. I saw it in Canada. I don't know about the U.K. Like the protesters were holding up the American flag and the British flag, and there were people in the West who were saying, "Well, democracy is great, but if they take it on, they're being colonized. It's better not to be colonized." And like that whole, okay, I was born in India. I grew up in Canada. Both those countries were colonized by the British. I can talk about the harm that colonization does, but it also did some good. And, Western ideas, they're not Western, they're universal. Like you can trace them back for thousands of years all over the world.
Yeah, I agree.
But to say that to live in subjugation is better than, I mean, it's better to be colonized by these people and not those people because these people aren't white. Like, I don't get that. And I don't get where that idea of this is not for you because you're brown. Like, I find that incredibly insulting. Like, I work in IT. Like science is not for me. Like, excuse me.
Yeah, so there's so many with the whole decolonize the curriculum, whatever movement. There are so many intellectual flaws to it. It's unbelievable. One of which, as you already alluded to, it kind of proposes a new form of essentialism. We are trying to challenge the notion that being brown or being black or whatever has, is this kind of fixed, narrow identity, a kind of stereotype. But this is what they're doing is actually creating a new form of stereotype. This idea that, being African or Indian or whatever that may be, means that you are somehow unable or shouldn't necessarily be engaging with many of the ideas that we so heavily enjoy. That is in some ways a very a reimagining of many of the actual colonial ideas that they would argue against. That this kind of noble savage is better to be kept in the subjection and ignorance. It's really really astonishing stuff. But on top of that, again, it's just factually incorrect. As you describe, it's always been a symbiotic relationship. Now, of course, there were points historically that I, critique heavily, whether that was colonialism or what have you. But societies in Africa, in Asia, in Europe have always kind of mixed, and there's always been cross-cultural fertilization and understanding. So as I said, I completely agree with you. These ideas are often universal, and you can find many of the echoes of these ideas in many spiritual, religious, or intellectual traditions in many other parts of the world. So I think it's both a demeaning idea, but it's also just fundamentally and factually wrong. And the last thing I'll say about it is, and I can't speak for all of those people, but I do often wonder how many of the people that argue this most vociferously have really spent time in other parts of the world. I have people contacting me that traveled to the West from former communist states and saying it's very weird how we're all of a sudden affirming and defending the reduction of free speech. I spent a year living in Morocco. My heritage is Nigerian, and when I speak to many people that came from other parts, huge gratitude. So happy for the opportunities and freedoms that they enjoy here. And so I do often wonder, many people that argue against free speech so strongly, how much time have you actually spent in other parts of the world?
Yeah, I don't get that either. I mean, I was lucky enough that I've been traveling since I was a little kid. And then my work when I was overseas, I traveled everywhere. But I worked in Sudan. I saw how people lived there.
Wow.
I was in Haiti after the earthquake. Like even under Aristide and things like that, like how limited they had. And I come back to Canada and there are articles about how air conditioning is sexist. It's like, come on.
Yeah.
Is there, can we find? Sorry, go ahead.
One of the things I just think, I mean, I don't know whether to be somewhat kind of happy about it or despairing. So happy insofar as is this the benefits of freedom? Have we got to a point where we have moved so forward as a society that we have to make up the most minutiae and benign things to get offended about? Or is it despairing that we are also at the same time, I always mention this, a few months ago Elon Musk launched a rocket into space. I mean, we are really a society, as a civilization, on the cusp of so many incredible technological transformations, and all we can talk about is whether air conditioning is sexist. Should I be happy about that or should I be despairing? I don't know.
Yeah, but it's okay. I mean, but it's like the whole thing. Like I've been reading. Like I said, I came back in 2014. I didn't know what was going on, and then I started a couple of years ago. I really started reading like the critical race theory stuff.
Yeah.
And as soon as I started reading it, I'm like, okay, this is insane. But you mentioned that you got to school last year. But I look at I can't remember if it was Cambridge or if it was Oxford. It was a big university in England. Okay, get rid of the classics, get rid of old white men. I remember one of them a couple of years back wanted to get rid of Shakespeare. You had that at Yale or Stanford. They got rid of the classics department. I agree with bring in other traditions. There's a tradition of Stoic philosophy in India going back over 2,000 years. Bring that stuff into universities. Let people teach it. You can teach that as part of the classics department. It's this, it's the same thought. They took it from the Greeks. They expanded on it. Like, why not add that to your classics department? I don't like. I read it and I see what they're saying. Like, decolonize, deconstruct, dismantle. But there's no talk of adding anything. So when you were in school, like, did anyone come up and say, "Here, can we add this to the curriculum?" Or was there any constructive stuff done, or was it all just take this apart? You can't listen to this. You can't talk to this.
Well, yeah, I mean, I personally find that it's not really productive and constructive. And I think we can see that, in relation to the recent debates and protests that have happened. A lot of people talk about educate yourself, do the work, do the reading. But the people that they suggest are a very specific and narrow set of people
Yeah.
to actually read. And many of those people, I would, wouldn't necessarily argue, Robin DiAngelo, for example, are the most kind of intellectual, nuanced thinkers. But I mean, they don't suggest people like Thomas Sowell or like Larry Elder, Glenn Lowry, many African American thinkers at the moment who fundamentally challenge many of the orthodoxies around race that we have today. So a lot of the time, again, as I said earlier, I think ultimately I find it to be deeply ideological. It's not a critique of maybe a very narrow canonical curriculum. It's essentially let's replace one quite narrow curriculum with another. It's not actually trying to broaden it in a meaningful sense. And I don't, generally speaking, support it. But there's another thing I'll say. I think it might be different in America and Canada, but ultimately Britain is in Europe. So the idea that we shouldn't have a Eurocentric curriculum, I find quite bizarre. If I went to Africa, like I would hope that if I went to an African university, I'll be learning more predominantly about African writers and thinkers and the history. So if I go to Europe, presumably predominantly you'll be learning about European history and the kind of the history of kind of European ideas and so on. Of course, let's bring in other ideas and world history and different thinkers, but I don't find it inherently problematic to be in Europe and learn predominantly about Europe.
Yeah, it's the same thing here. Okay, and I get this from my father. I remember I was in my late teens, and it was around Christmas time, and there was a friend of his in there, and one of his, like the guy who did his deliveries, came in and said, "Ah, this is my last delivery before Christmas." My father wished him a Merry Christmas. Family's Muslim. His friend, I think, was Pakistani or Indian or whatever, and said, "Well, how can you wish him a Merry Christmas?" He's like, "We're in a predominantly Christian country." He's like, "Muslims respect Jesus. It's his birthday. I just wish the guy a Merry Christmas. Like, what's the big deal?" And this attitude, and again, I think it's got to do with education. Uh, that you hate your own culture. Like, I've never seen that anywhere except since I got back in the West, where everyone's taught to, like, Brits or Americans or Canadians or whatever, Northern Europeans, they're taught to hate themselves. They're taught to hate their culture, or you're taught that that culture's kept you down and will always keep you down.
Mm.
I don't see how that leads towards social cohesion at all.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think this is unfortunately, so much of it just isn't reflective. Even if I may or may not have agreed with some of the goals, we can look and see that that isn't productive, that isn't constructive. I mean, as you were just talking about, a lot of the things that they describe is a sense of, alienation and a feeling of otherization within society. But I find it bizarre because at the same time they will cultivate a sense that they will never belong. They'll say that the society is essentially against them, that the cards are stacked against them. There's nothing that they can do about it. So how can you feel that you belong in a society? How can you feel like this country is your home and that you want to contribute to making it more positive, whilst all you have to say about it is negative and demeaning and destructive things? I think that will ultimately obviously lead to a sense of alienation from the society you are living in. But on top of that, I think it's and I mention this a lot, I mean, what is being taught could not be more disempowering and demoralizing to a young generation of people, particularly one that is growing up in a society that could be better, don't get me wrong, but the fundamental opportunities that we enjoy is incredible. Like, and the strides we've made, not just in terms of freedoms over historical time, but in regards to race relations, is huge. I mean, the triumph in terms of laws and attitudes has fundamentally transformed in the last 30 years. So now that we are now at a point where we can perhaps say, actually, we've done pretty well for ourselves in terms of, a cultural and social and ideological shift. To now say society could never have been worse, it's completely divorced from reality, in my view.
Yeah, no, I don't know where they get that from. But okay, the critical race theory stuff, and again,
Mm,
this is like, for me, it's the education. This is where a lot of the attacks on speech coming from. But okay, North America, we took enlightenment from the UK and from France. But how are like critical race theory came out of U.S. law. It came out of U.S. law schools. It was dealing with racism in the U.S. based on the legal system. How the hell does that get translated over to the UK?
I mean, one of the things America, has been worried about whether or not China is going to be undermining it in relation to global cultural hegemony. But I think the Black Lives Matter protest has demonstrated that America is definitely in the game when it comes to cultural exportation. And yeah, I mean, a lot of us have been blindsided by just the, importing of the US racial culture wars into the British situation. And there are some similarities, but there are fundamental differences. I mean, in Britain, our police are perhaps the most demilitarized police in the world. They don't even carry guns, they're super friendly. They're really kind of about community policing and so on. Obviously, the majority of the black people in Britain came in the last 30, 40 years, in the post-war migration years. There are some descendants that came here hundreds of years ago, but most of them would have married within English people, and so their children essentially would be white at this point. So the overwhelming majority of black people came. So, this whole narrative that's been imported from America does not speak to at all what's going on in Britain. I mean, I saw a recent thing where some protesters in the UK were shouting "Hands up, don't shoot" to a disarmed British police force, and this is the kind of absurdity that we're seeing. And yeah, it's really astonishing. I mean, another thing that I just find really interesting, in America, we've been hearing this whole thing about defunding the police. In Britain, I mean, the left in Britain has been talking about the police being underfunded for the past, 10 years. And now they're all of a sudden saying defund the police.
Yeah,
It's you've got to laugh because it's just, it would be funny if it wasn't so sad.
no. Okay, same thing in Canada. I mean, as soon as the protest started in the states, blah blah blah. Canadian police, killing too many people, and you look at the statistics. We don't have as many statistics. They they like hamstrung the Stats Canada. It was 450 shootings between 2000 and 2017, or 450 people were killed by the police. That's half of what less than half of what the U.S. does in 1 year over 17 years. And our government's saying, "Oh, the police are hunting people." It's
Mm.
like it's a little ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, a similar thing in Britain, one of the things that they've been mentioning is this whole idea of people dying in police custody. According to their own statistics, a white individual was 25% more likely to die in police custody than a black individual. Like, it is crazy from all of the statistics in Britain, from education to wealth. The picture is incredibly complex, and we really have to challenge this widely held idea that all racial disparities are exactly a result of racism. There are many different factors that contribute to the nuances and complexities in relation to racial inequalities. And again, all of this is being simplified, partly because of what you were talking about in relation to the critical race theorists. I mean, they literally say that racism is embedded in every facet of society. I did an interview recently, and a critical race theorist was on the panel with me, and she said that we have to think of racism as the air. That's literally what she said. That's something that we breathe and live every single moment of our day, and there's nothing essentially that we can do about it. And I just think they have no positive vision for the future. What vision? How do we, if even if that was true, which I don't believe it is true, how do we overcome that? All it is a kind of permanent revolution. It's a kind of permanent reorganizing of society in their own image. That is not a vision for social cohesion, for freedom, for progress. That is a vision for social racialization and a kind of power game, in my view.
Yeah, and I mean, and it's a cult. Like I saw it. I, I never spoke out. I was now not an activist of any kind. But when I came back and I saw how people were being, like, how Ayan Ursi Ali was being treated when she spoke out against Islam. She was one of the first people. Even someone like Mariam Namazi, and then, or Majid, like he's a reformer, he's still a Muslim, being called things like house Muslim. And then I look at the race, like all the talk around race, and it's the same tactics to shut people up. So you'd mentioned Glenn Valerie and Larry Elder, but I mean, in the UK, I'll take Trevor Phillips and Priti Patel.
Mm.
You take like Glenn Lowry or Thomas Chatterton Williams. I know he's in France, but Camille Foster, excuse me. Any of these
Yeah,
people, they get the worst insults hurled at them because
mm,
they're the wrong type of black person. Or
yeah,
Priti Patel, like, disagree with her politics, I don't care. But to have the Guardian draw her as a cow with a nose ring, or I can't remember where it was with Trevor Phillips, they're calling him a coconut and he's not black enough. It's the same tactics to shut people down, and it's racism for progress. I mean, it's the only way I can call it. Like, I don't know what the hell it is. Like, it's insane.
well, this is what I was saying earlier in relation to when we were talking about, objectivity being a whiteness or
Yeah.
whatever. What we've seen, and I really believe that the woke radicals, so to speak, have really overplayed their hand because they've really revealed the absolutely dehumanizing ideas that they have in relation to ethnic minorities. They see them as essentially just political pawns in order to push forward a particular, ideological agenda. If we progress to me would be welcoming ideological and intellectual diversity amongst black people, Asian people, what have you. That I welcome black conservatives, black leftists, blacks, all sorts, because that shows that people no longer have their politics specifically defined by their racial interests. I think that's a positive thing. That's progress. And for me, racial essentialism, racism, I fundamentally oppose it wherever it comes from. So, I don't accept this idea that, because you believe that you are acting on some virtuous or moral superior values, that means that you have the green light to use racially derogatory term. I mean, yeah, as you described, coconut coon. This is disgusting. And you were saying that, if you are a black person or an Asian person who feel like they belong, who feel patriotic, who feel proud and happy and positive in their life, and don't believe that their racial identity is the most important or significant thing about them, that means that you are somehow inauthentic. And so, these categories no longer become as Martin Luther King famously said, just the color of our skin. Now they are imbuing them with such significant meaning, a set of prescribed behaviors, attitudes, dress sense, speech, in order to be authentically black or authentically Asian. That's not progress to me. That's a new form of racism. That's a new form of racial essentialism.
Yeah. Well, okay. I don't know if it's a new. It's an old form under with. It's got nicer clothing on. That's all it is. They've dressed it up in nicer terms. But it's the exact same thing. There. I don't know if you've heard of it. You can look it up in the States. They used to say uppity, like, so, and they would like uppity black people, but they would use like the N word, right? Oh,
Mm.
they're acting like they're betters, and this is the same stuff. I mean, there's a book called Acting White, came out in 2013, I think, and
Yeah.
there's sections in it on how Obama was dressing white and talking white, and you shouldn't do that. It's the
Yeah.
same thing as racists saying, "Oh, you're uppity." Like,
No, but the reason why I say it's new, and I totally know what you mean in regards to, it's an old form dressed up, but it's a kind of alliance between a so-called anti-racist and perhaps white liberals, so to speak, and the power structure. So I think that the alliance and the way in which it plays out, I think, is kind of new. Other than kind of old form, kind of racism of like the kind of white supremacist ideas in the kind of traditional sense. This is, now framed as progressive.
yeah, yeah, it's crazy. Look, I know you're busy, so I just wanted to give you a last word. If you wanted to give people like a way to embrace free speech, like if you want to give your best sales pitch for it, and then let people know where they can get a hold of you, where they can follow you, please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think that free speech is more than just like the right to express your opinion. And I think that um, people just think it, as I said earlier, it is just this kind of random thing, that's kind of convenient that we have. But essentially, the question is, why would you want to know anyone else's opinion? And the reason you'd want to know someone else's opinion is because we could be wrong. As John Stuart Mill says, we are not infallible. And there's so many things that we have been wrong about historically. And I'm sure there's going to be many things that we are wrong about presently and also in the future. And the very process to which we can correct that is by having an environment as open as possible to exchange ideas, so we can challenge each other, so we can find out, the things that someone else might have that we might not have. And that also means people that we fundamentally oppose, fundamentally dislike. As much there's many ideas, even these, woke people. I'm happy that even though I fundamentally disagree with them, I'm happy that they can speak so I can know what I truly believe. And, these are, some of the most basic, obvious arguments in regards to free speech. And, if we do meaningfully believe that, then I think we can't just support it. I do believe that we have to, unfortunately, in this perilous climate, to be active defenders of it. Oh my God, I sound like those woke people that say, you can't just not be racist, you have to be anti-racist. But
Oh,
in some senses, in this pitch, I would say it's somewhat similar because it is hugely under threat. And I think, if someone's trying to censor you, if you've said nothing wrong, do not apologize ever. Stand your ground. It's your fundamental right. If you have, children or grandchildren, speak to them about free speech, engage them in these ideas. I think that we really have to be much more proactive now in cultivating that climate, cultivating a culture of critique, if we are, meaningfully going to withstand the onslaught that we are facing at this moment. But things are looking promising. I think a lot of people are waking up to cancel culture. They're waking up to what's happening in the universities. And I actually think COVID-19 and the consequences of that even potentially could be a space for huge, new thinking. And so every action in some ways has an equal opposite reaction. And I really hope that, what we've seen over the last few months in regards to the destructive censorship, it will really be a huge wake-up call to a lot of people that we really need to defend our fundamental values and principles. So yeah, that's my closing speech. And please find me on Twitter, Inaya Folarin. That's the best place to find me, I think.
yeah. I'll put all the links down. I'll put links to Free Speech Union and stuff. Well, thank you very much, Anaya, for coming on. It was great talking to you. And yeah,
Thank
thank
you.
everyone for listening.